So the book is long, as you will see. My publishers have done a very, very good job of making a book that's, well, I don't want to see how many pages it is, but a very, very long book look not so long. And I'm very grateful to them for that, so people won't be frightened about it. But the book has 3 parts. The first part is called Origins. And in that book, in Origins, I introduce the matriarch of the Hemings family, Elizabeth Hemings, who's born in 1735. We have fragmentary information about her. When she's born, about where she's born, that she was owned by the Epps family. The chapter is called Young Elizabeth's World, and what I try to do is to sort of evoke that time and place, the area around Williamsburg in the 1730s, which was, well, if you go to Williamsburg today, it would not look like, obviously for obvious reasons, like the demographics would not look like the Williamsburg of that time. I mean, for very obvious reasons, African Americans today don't have much interest in dressing up like slaves and walking around Williamsburg to try to show the demographics of it. I mean, it's interesting to do reenactments and things like that, but that's sort of difficult to reproduce a world that was English and African. Large numbers of Africans. In the 1730s, more Africans were brought into Virginia than in any other time, any other decade in the Old Dominion's history. It's a place of, as I said, English people, Africans, not one kind of African. Africans are not monolithic. Different people speaking different languages. We think of today's world as a multicultural world, that term that has both pejorative, positive and negative connotations, but this is multicultural, multilingual world at the time that she was born into. So I try to evoke that time period to give people a sense of the country at its beginnings, and the slave system sort of maturing at that point, and the world that she would have encountered during that time period. I then introduced John Wales, who would become Elizabeth Hemings's owner and the father of 6 of her children. In order to do that, it gave me an excuse to go to England and go to Lancashire and work with the genealogist there to sort of ferret out John Wales's life and background, a fascinating man who comes to the colony and makes his living, a man from a very, very poor background, who is raised up by a man named Philip Ludwell and made a lawyer and becomes very wealthy. I introduced John Wales and then talk about Jefferson, John Wales's daughter, Martha, whom he marries, and bring the family to Monticello and talk about the Revolution and some of the Hemings family's interactions and what happened to them during the Revolution, a time of great turmoil everywhere, but certainly within the African American community, many of whom wanted to join the Loyalists and the British, who had promised them freedom to the rebels, the slaves of rebels who would join their army. So this is a very, very volatile time, and the Hemingses are part of that as well. Origins, the first section ends with the death of Martha Jefferson, which was, as you all know, a searing experience for Thomas Jefferson. But it was also an important situation for sort of change the Hemingses' life as well, because Jefferson decides to take a commission to France, which he had declined before because his wife was too ill. And this really begins, as I say, the family's dispersal, psychological and physical. The older sons, Martin, Robert, and James Hemings, had been up until this point living, while Jefferson is away from Monticello, living in different parts of Virginia and Richmond, sort of working on their own, keeping their wages and so forth. So they had some sense of autonomy, greater sense of autonomy than what you would think of would be the typical enslaved person. Jefferson decides to take James Hemings to Paris with him to train him, to have him trained to become a chef. And so he leaves the continent altogether. His brothers remain here, the sisters remain here. Some of them are leased out. Elizabeth Hemings remains at Monticello. Sally Hemings is sent to Eppington to live with Jefferson's two younger daughters, with whom he leaves her with Elizabeth Epps, who was her half-sister. So this very tangled Virginia genealogy going on here. And the family's life is transformed by the death of Martha Jefferson in much the same way that Thomas Jefferson's life was transformed. Because if you think of, this is one of the features of being an item of property, is that when the sort of great events of life occur, death, birth, when people get married, property changes hands and slaves change hands. Well, here with Martha's death, the Hemingses were pretty much assured that they would stay in one place, at least they would stay under the ownership of Jefferson. But when he decides to move and do different things, that changes their lives as well. So we end Origins, and we go on to the Vaunted Scene of Europe, which I stole from Jefferson as the title for the second section. That is Jefferson explaining to Charles Bellini when he's about to talk about, now let me tell you about the Vaunted Scene of Europe. The Vaunted Scene of Europe is about James and Sally Hemings in that sense, and I try to make, these sections are about their view of what they encountered when they went to France. James Hemings begins to train to become a chef. He is actually, at some point, and he finds out, on what is close to being free soil in France. There was a phrase, there are no slaves in France, that wasn't exactly true. But there were slaves, people who were enslaved in France, but it was a place where people could file petitions for freedom. And in the 18th century, hundreds of people filed petitions for freedom in France, and every single one of them was granted. So this was a pro forma thing for enslaved people, is if they wanted their freedom, they could take their freedom. And at some point, it became so clear what the Admiralty Court, that was the court that would grant the petition for freedom, was going to do, that some slave owners began to just free their slaves on their own, rather than fight them in court. Because the other thing they had, what was called fee shifting. The losing party had to pay for the case. So you could see what happens if you know the slave is going to be freed no matter what, and you lose, then you have to pay the costs. They just took them down to the Admiralty Court and freed them on their own.